before diving in to talk a little bit about the Enough Project and what we do as an organization. So me personally, I grew up outside of Boston, Massachusetts, in a small suburban town, and I have a younger brother who's actually also a freshman in college, and I grew up in a Jewish family, and the faith community that I was a part of was really important to me in my life. We were very progressive, very reform, but it was something that really stuck with me throughout my life, and a lot of my initial sort of values and traditions came from a lot of the teachings of that tradition. Additionally, my father is an immigrant. He grew up in South Africa and moved here when he was 19 years old. And so hearing about his stories of actually growing up in apartheid South Africa, he moved here 14 years before the end of apartheid. So he experienced a lot of that, and hearing about those stories is something that definitely helped to shape my understandings of what I consider to be right and wrong in the world, and all the gray area in between of those areas. So as I said, I grew up in a Jewish community and became really active in middle school and high school, and took on a lot of just social justice activities, mostly because it was where my friends were, and that was the open position at the time. And I was like, what is social justice? And sort of just through taking that on in high school and planning small community service projects, I started to explore this idea of justice and righteousness, almost accidentally in a way. I think sometimes you kind of just fall into that and become really interested and passionate. After I went to college, I went to Tufts University, which is also outside of Boston, and I went to study international relations because I was really interested in a lot of things, and I thought that IR would combine a lot of the various aspects of the humanities that I was interested in: history, politics, religion, culture, language. All of those things seem to wrap up neatly into IR. And so I went there to study that, and took a lot of classes about sort of interethnic and interreligious conflict, as I'm really just interested in that sort of human side to conflict happening in the world and how it affects individual people. While I was doing that, I was also getting really involved in the Hillel at Tufts, and through being a part of that group, had the opportunity to take a trip to Berlin in the winter of my sophomore year, and went to a concentration camp for the first time. And we went to Sachsenhausen and sort of experienced what being in a concentration camp is like now. That was a really sort of definitely a pivotal moment for me, I think. It's hard to be in that kind of place and not be struck by the sort of awesomeness in the way of awe, not in the cool way, of what that means. And so I came back to campus really energized and excited about teaching about the Holocaust and teaching about genocide. And as I started doing more general sort of Holocaust and genocide education work, both on campus and in classrooms around Massachusetts, I was, one of the things that we generally end our lessons on is that concept of never again. And that idea of, okay, the Holocaust happened, it was horrible, what can we learn from it? This will never happen again in our lifetimes. And as you all know, it has. And so at the same time that I was sort of teaching this and talking with middle school students about it, and the lessons that we can learn from it, I'm reading newspaper articles and sitting in on classes where we're talking about the ongoing conflicts in the world. I didn't have a particular focus in Africa. I was sort of more thematically based on interreligious and interethnic conflict. And, it just became obvious to me that there's a huge dissonance and a big disconnect between what I was teaching and what I was learning and experiencing about the world. And so after I graduated, I went out to California and started to work for an interfaith social justice organization, and we were mobilizing communities around social justice issues, specifically on global health. And that was really fun and really great, and I love working with different faith communities and doing interfaith work and building bridges and building connections. But I missed a lot of that international aspect, and we were trying to make connections globally and locally in the communities out in California with malaria happening in Sierra Leone, and it was really tough because no one in that community experienced malaria or really understood what it meant. And I grappled with trying to, bridge those two a little bit and build those connections for people to get them to take action. And after the fellowship ended, I came back to the East Coast because I decided that I really wanted to work in the international sphere and that was the part of the fellowship that drew me in the most. But most of the jobs in international politics and such are on the East Coast, so this is where I came. I spent 7 months unemployed and doing part-time work and doing research, and it was a lot of fun, and we can talk afterwards at some point if any of you are curious about the job search, although you're freshmen, so you have a while mostly. But it can be very stressful. And then I sort of fell into this work at the Enough Project. What's exciting about the Enough Project is that it works to bridge gaps between an activist community and people who, like me, have passion for changing the world and taking on an issue and trying to make something better in an area that needs a lot of attention, while also connecting to policymakers and change makers at a really high level who actually have the ability to influence policy. And the way that those two things work together is something that we strive to build at the Enough Project. And so now is really an exciting moment for this movement. I feel that there's a lot of energy and passion out there. It's been 10 years since Darfur was declared a genocide, and it's been 2 decades since the war in Congo has been going on, and these conflicts that we deal with have been happening for a really long time and are still not solved and are affecting more and more people every single day. And so it's exciting to be able to tackle this with people, hopefully with people like yourselves who are interested and curious, and with others around the country and around the world, and especially people in the places where these conflicts are taking place, who are the ones making change. So that's just a little bit about myself. I find that in all of this work, it's really important, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, to make connections and to tell stories and to learn about yourself and learn about others. I come to this work because I care about the individuals that are affected by these issues, not just the conflicts as sort of a big picture, let's look at statistics kind of way. And so recognizing a lot of the humanity in people that you're working with is something that's really important. So just wanted to start, I guess, can move on to the next thing by talking about what is the Enough Project, finally. I've been saying that for a while, and Fifi gave it a great overview. As she said, we're a policy and advocacy organization dedicated to ending genocide and crimes against humanities. We focus on some of the places where the world's worst atrocities are occurring, and oftentimes the places that we look at in Central and Eastern and the Horn of Africa really aren't getting media attention. Either aren't getting media attention at all, or are getting media attention that pales in comparison to conflicts in other areas of the world, which is a huge problem. And it's not that we want to, take away media attention from the other issues, but it's that these are conflicts that have been going on for decades in a lot of ways, and we have a real opportunity to make a difference, but no one's talking about it. There's a lot going on in the world, but this is something that is important to keep in mind as well. So the areas that we focus on, I mentioned a couple of them, are the Democratic Republic of Congo, the Sudan, now South Sudan, Central African Republic, and areas affected by the Lord's Resistance Army, which is Joseph Kony's rebel group. And so that's more of a regionally based organization. Enough was founded back in 2007. As I mentioned before about sort of building some of those bridges, we were between policymakers and activists. That was actually how we came to be. Our founders, John Prendergast and Gail Smith, were members during the Save Darfur movement, members of the administration, and had worked in the White House and were involved in politics. And while they were doing that, there was the Save Darfur movement. Are you guys familiar with the Save Darfur movement? It was a little bit of a while ago. Okay, yeah, see some nods. So it was mostly, around the height of the genocide, 2003, 2005, and beyond, that faith communities, students, colleges, public activists across the U.S. Really took action on the conflict in Darfur, in Sudan. And built a huge movement and tried to affect change when this region was in a state of genocide. And so what John Prendergast and Gail Smith noticed was that there was a bit of a disconnect between this giant movement of activists, who were bringing millions of people to the National Mall to protest, and this huge movement of people, and the policymakers who were actually involved in making decisions, who were involved in the U.S. government, who were involved in setting policy. They both really cared about this issue, but they weren't speaking the same language. They were asking for different things. They weren't listening to each other. There was no way to really connect the two because they're very different worlds. And so they founded the Enough Project to try to be that gap and to try to fit in that niche spot and connect activists in the activist world to policymakers and vice versa, so that they were helping to inform one another, so that activists and campaigns that happen nationwide are done in a way that speak the same language and influence what actual policies can be implemented, and that those policymakers are listening to the activists and recognize their value and see the need to take seriously their concerns and what they have to say. So that was how we were founded about 7-ish years ago now. Our kind of theory of change and how we work is it starts with direct field research. So we have what we consider sort of eyes and ears on the ground in the issue areas, in the conflict areas that we work on. And they connect with local civil society groups, other partners. They're on the ground doing interviews and conducting sort of independent research on what's happening, the state of play, the possible solutions, what's going on. They then bring all that information, usually via email, multiple times a day, to our DC office and work with our policy analysts and our research and policy team to come up with policy analysis and policy recommendations that are sort of rooted in this on-the-ground understanding and connected with the sort of DC eyes and ears, are in line with and in tune with what's sort of possible to do at a U.S. government or UN level. And so they come up with research and policies that can go out to the public. But public folks don't often like to read, 20-page papers, and it's not super translatable to a lot of audiences. And politicians, especially, as I'm sure many of you know, are really moved by constituents, and they're moved by people who vote them into office. That's who they work for. That's what they care about, getting voted back in. And so they oftentimes listen to, they'll read reports and they'll listen to data and all, but they also really care about what the people that they work for actually have to say. And so that's where the advocacy and campaigns team comes in. And what we work to do, that's where I work at Enough, we work to translate a lot of that field research and policy recommendations into campaigns and into general advocacy that's applicable for different audiences. So we'll take reports and work to create campaigns that the public can get involved in. We'll work to send out briefs to various offices, work with congressional staff or partner organizations who are also interested in this work. So that's kind of our theory of change, as in hitting them from all sides, from sort of a policy and research angle, as well as a public messaging, media, constituency engagement angle, will hopefully help to motivate people to actually implement policies that can affect change on the ground. Any questions. I should say from the outset also, we'll leave plenty of time for Q&A at the end, but if you do have questions or thoughts or comments, please feel free to jump in. I much prefer conversations. So, okay.
And as Joe Eldridge would say, this isn't the kind of event where you have to hide your comment as a pseudo question.
No.
You can actually just speak your piece.
If you have something to add or a different experience or anything, if you've been involved in any of this kind of work, I know you all have a wide range of experiences. I'd love to hear about it. So definitely jump right in. So quick background on a couple of our issue areas. Sudan and South Sudan in particular, I won't get into too much detail because we do have plenty of resources on our website, and you're all smart people who can do research and find things out too. But just to help sort of point it out on a map a little bit and give you a sense of the size and space and all, and you can kind of see Darfur is on the western edge there. So Sudan gained independence from Britain and Egypt in 1956, and they've been at war for a lot of that time. Essentially, a lot of the fighting comes down to an exploitative government who's after power and wealth and tries to consolidate the power and wealth within the government of Khartoum, the capital of Sudan. So they've experienced 2 civil wars between 1956 and today. The civil wars, mostly between the north and the south, and you can see where South Sudan has now seceded. As part of a peace agreement in 2005, it was agreed upon that South Sudanese would vote in a referendum for secession, or whether or not to secede, in 2011. And they voted overwhelmingly to secede from Sudan and become their own country. They're the world's newest nation. And they've been a country since July of 2011. While that was happening, and very much part and parcel with that, the government was trying to quell uprisings and protests that were taking place because of an unequal distribution of wealth and power. It was, disenfranchisement and power grabbing from the central government. And the people on sort of the periphery of Sudan, in the areas of Darfur and Blue Nile and South Kordofan and eastern Sudan as well, experienced a lot of oppression and discrimination. And so when they would protest, the government would crack down in incredibly violent ways. And one of the protests in Darfur, actually, the government sent in government-sponsored militias, Janjaweed, to quell those uprisings. And what they ended up doing was targeting people on the basis of race and religion, and committing a lot of human rights abuses and atrocities. And that is not something that happened in 2003, 2004. That's something that continues to happen today, not just in Darfur, but in many places throughout Sudan. And the government is actually now sponsoring, they've taken these Janjaweed militias, who used to be just sort of loosely affiliated with the government, and they, back in early 2000s, kind of tried to hide the fact that they weren't actually government-sponsored. They're now actually officially a part of the government. They're a part of the security forces. They've rebranded them as Rapid Support Forces, and they're the Janjaweed from 10 years ago, and they're committing the same atrocities. More people have been displaced in the last year, almost 400,000, from Darfur. And so people are internally displaced and displaced as refugees flowing into Chad. And because of the longevity of this conflict, people have now grown up in these refugee camps, and they've completely lost their sense of Darfuri identity because they've been in these camps for 10 years now at this point, and their way of life has really been destroyed. And so that's something that they're looking to get back into their country if possible. In South Sudan also, just quickly, there's actually a new conflict that broke out in 2013, last December, so not quite a year ago. Similar in that it's about sort of power sharing and wealth. The president and the former vice president of South Sudan their sort of political struggle overspilled onto the streets of Juba on December 15th of last year and became a new conflict with millions displaced and at risk of starvation and a looming famine coming up. So that's another huge conflict that we're looking at as well. And just quickly to touch on the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo is roughly, to give everyone a size visual, is roughly the size of Western Europe. It's the largest country in Africa. It's huge, and it's vastly wealthy in mineral resources. And there's a lot of different ethnic groups that are a part of that country as well. The conflict that's been going on there has been taking place for about 20 years now. It's been going on for about 2 decades. It's the deadliest conflict since World War II, with now almost 6 million people that have died due to war-related causes. There's widespread sexual violence, widespread human rights abuses, and it's largely out of the media, unfortunately, even though the numbers are staggering and nothing reaches it quite at that peak. There's also a lot of involvement from regional actors. A lot of the conflict began in the aftermath of the Rwandan genocide, when Hutus and perpetrators of the genocide over there flowed into Congo through the border that they share, and because so many of the ethnic groups are similar between Rwanda and Congo, a lot of the violence continued, and so Rwanda is actually backing some of the uprisings and groups in Congo, but it's hugely complex with over 40 armed groups at various times. The Congolese army is also a perpetrator of human rights abuses and war crimes, and all of the various armed groups interact in a lot of different factions in a lot of different ways. And so one of the many reasons why this issue has not been reported on as much as I feel and many others feel it really should have is because of the complexity and because of all the varying competing interests of the groups. One of the interests is in one of the ways that some of these armed groups actually control power and consolidate and get funding in order to commit these atrocities as they search for power is through minerals that they mine in Congo. As I mentioned, it's one of the wealthiest countries as far as natural resources are concerned. And because of that, it's heavily exploited. And there's tons of multinational corporations who are in there as well, but the armed groups are controlling a lot of the mines through very violent means in order to gain wealth from the minerals that come from those mines. And that's one thing we look at too.
I think we had a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm looking at like gender-based violence. I was wondering if you could just expand on that topic.
In Congo specifically? Yeah, so Congo is home to some of the worst gender-based and gender-based violence and sexual violence, and it's used really as a weapon of war. Sexual violence is used in Congo similarly to many other places. How it's not about the crime of rape itself necessarily, but it's a way to destroy communities, destroy families, and gain power. And so when we look at sexual violence and gender-based violence in these areas, various armed groups are all, committing crimes, and it's really a weapon of control, essentially. Do you mean, yeah. I'm not an expert on trafficking specifically from Congo, so I don't want to speak to that too much specifically, but I'm happy to find out more and get back to you on that. Yeah, come talk to me afterwards. Give me an email. Yeah, any other questions on stuff so far? Yeah.
I think I have a question here. I come from Sudan and South Sudan.
Yeah.
Before it was Sudan and now
Right.
I find myself in South Sudan. I used to be a student here 3 months ago. I'm no longer a student here. My question is, what is the role of China and Russia in the conflicts in Africa? Because you were saying that the media is not doing a lot. I'm in the media industry. We put a lot of stories out there, but some people, like for instance in the United States, they would say, what the hell is that all about? You see? So as much as we do our best to bring these stories out, there are giants here at the United Nations who do business with Sudan government, and when anything comes up about Darfur, they just kill it. They veto it. And so my question is, what should we do
Yeah.
to fight these giants?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think there are probably a lot of answers. I don't think there's one thing that can be done necessarily. One tactic that we're looking at, that we have done a lot with, that we've worked on a lot with Congo, that we're starting to look at with Sudan, is where it's getting its funding. Especially, after the partition of Sudan and South Sudan, as oil revenues, they used to sell the oil to various international, governments and corporations. As oil revenues have decreased, finding out, where else are they getting their funding, and where else are they doing business, who's doing business with them, and tracing and tracking some of where the revenues are coming from. One thing that we've found has been particularly profitable for the government of Sudan is gold. And I'll talk about gold in the context of Congo, but in Sudan as well, in North Darfur, there are some gold mines that are they're controlled by actors who are committing lots of atrocities and funneling a lot of that money through to the government of Sudan. And so we think that one way to address the problem might be to tackle and target, where those funding sources are coming from, who's buying from them, and open that up and make that a little bit more transparent, so that when people are doing business, the people that are buying from these businesses are aware of where these corporations are actually getting the resources and the minerals used, that are then being funneled back to Sudan. Because you're completely right that it's just gridlock, and that those giants are, really hard to deal with. And clearly, what we've been doing so far is not working. Do you have, your own suggestions or ideas on how to tackle that issue, given your experience?
Well, based on the history of conflict in Sudan, here in the United States, the faith-based groups lobbied so hard during the time of George W. Jr. And that helped for United States to tighten its grip on Sudan. And they told Sudan, look, if you don't sign an agreement with the rebels in the south, we'll do what we did with Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein. And so that led Bashir to get scared. And so he was able to concede, and the peace agreement was signed in 2005. And consequently, there was a referendum. And South Sudan is a separate country now in a mess, but it was a step forward.
Yeah.
My thinking is a community like this could be used
Yeah.
to speak out. You don't know who is in this room,
Yeah.
who is related to who, and that's how it works. Who is networking with who. So a community like this could be used to really spread the word out that, look, what is happening in Darfur is just like what is happening to the Yazidis
Yeah.
in Iraq right now. If the world is acting to stop the ISIS from crushing the minorities in Iraq, why is the world not acting to stop the Sudan government from crushing people in Darfur?
When the crimes are even more documented.
Yeah, because if we really depend on the media to send the word out there, the media will send the word out there, but people keep saying, what the hell is all about that for? But people like you and me could be able to reach out to, the powers to be, talk to them around. Maybe this is just my humble suggestion.
No, it's absolutely the right suggestion, and I don't know how everyone else in the room feels, but I think that's 100% why I'm here, and why I think we try to do the work that we do. I mean, from my own perspective, and this is something that I didn't talk about when I introduced myself, but sometimes do, I'm an American citizen. I was born and raised here in the States. I'm not Sudanese. I'm not Congolese. I can't, bring peace to nations that aren't my own, to communities that I don't, call a part of myself. What I can do is influence the actors that I do have some influence over, and that's the U.S. government, and that's the UN or international bodies. And so I'm actually going to share a couple stories from some folks on the ground in Congo, just because we have some good videos from them. to talk about this idea a little bit of supporting the work that's already happening. The Enough Project, at least as an NGO here in DC, is looking to make inroads exactly as you were saying, sort of where we do have influence with the media here, with the public here. How can students here take action in their own communities and in their own ways, and in ways that are affected by people who actually listen to you. The Congolese, which you'll see in a minute, just like the Sudanese and South Sudanese, they're the ones that have the solutions to these conflicts. They're the ones that are building peace in their communities. What we aim to do is support that work and empower others here to understand that work and amplify that message at an international level, so that it's heard at the highest levels that we can access. So I'm actually gonna move to that really quickly. Gonna share a story of one person in particular. We went to Congo a couple years ago and put together a video series with featuring 5 community activists, one of whom, Fidel Bafilemba, who you'll see after the intro, he's our field researcher in Goma in the east of Congo. And so he works for us, but he's also a community activist. He's a former rebel who has reformed and is now working for peace in his own community, in his own country. And as I sort of mentioned before, understanding the stories of people and understanding the individuals who are working at all of these levels to make change is one of the most important ways to be a human rights activist, is to, talk about this at that human level. So I'm going to try to load this if possible. I don't know if that will come up. It's working on here. Do you know if that'll... Oops. I don't know how to get that. One second. Any other questions while we load this? Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I'll actually talk about that a lot more after the video, but briefly, while we're doing this anyway, the Raise Hope for Congo campaign, thank you, was started a few years ago, and what we noticed, the Save Darfur movement was huge. There were, thousands of activists around the country who were involved and taking action, but there wasn't a movement like that for Congo. And the conflicts in Congo, perfect, thanks, didn't have that same movement or that same voice here in the U.S. And so we wanted to build that and ensure that message was getting out. So I'll talk a little bit more about the Conflict-Free Campus Initiative, which is the flagship program of Raise Hope for Congo. But this video series was actually one of the products that Raise Hope for Congo came out with as a way to share the voices of the change makers on the ground and bring that to everyone here in the U.S. to better understand it. Do you know how I can... Crap. I broke it.
Just have to,
Do I hit play?
there you go.
Oh, perfect. Great. Thank you.
I think in my bad guy days. So as you can see, these are all my people. Tonight, that's the one of the big things. People gonna rock big time here. Fidel Bafilemba, activists. Fernando Rico. Right.
Eunice Siwatula, défenseur judiciaire.
Amani Matabaro, community builder and footballer. time when Goma was doing quite well. During the night, they just ambush people, whether you give money or not, they're gonna kill you. Why don't we have laws? Why don't we have the pillaging of my country's resources? It's the epicenter of everything that is happening. The adult man you become in your life, being a good guy, or you can be a bad guy. And I think I have been both. Fidel Bafilemba's philosophy, it's critical thinking. I'm creating an activist movement. I would start teaching people that you can question things. Not Maimaes who would be waging war or scrambling for natural resources, raping, killing. No, people who are gonna make irons, cement, roads, toothpicks. We're probably the richest country on this planet. But still we can't make even batteries, and we're gonna import them from China. This is sugar, and we're importing it from Thailand, from India, and these are things we should be able to be making in our country. We have very rich, fertile land, but not being explored. And that's Congo mayhem, unfortunately. We have come to a point that we cannot really blame it all on the Belgian, because half a century after colonization, I think we should be able to have done something if we were a true nation. This is where we're having the first ever critical thinking school. Congolese have never been initiated to any questioning. If you question whatever was said, oh my God, you would have been taken to jail. That was crime. So we're going to change that cycle. We're going to show people that you can question your father's speeches. You can question the preachers, the churches, things like that. Not destroying them. I'm not calling for that. But we want to be making self-determined decisions. I tell my children, if I'm going to have to walk around naked for your education, I'm going to do it. I've never felt better elsewhere than in my mayhem here. That's me, the disorder in this country, but also the hope for a better future, a hope for educated people. That's me. Fidel Bafilemba, activists.
Okay. I don't know how to get this back, but so Fidel is one of our good friends and one of our researchers as well, and hopefully his story just talks a little bit about himself and some of the things that he cares about and what it is that he wants to do. So moving in to talk a little bit about Raise Hope, actually, and some of the things that we can all do, I believe really strongly that everyone has the ability to make change in some way in their own sphere. Like I said, I'm an American citizen, and so I see it as my duty to ensure that the American government and our policies and our companies are not having a negative influence on communities around the world. One of the things the Enough Project tries to do in supporting what others are doing is removing negative influences and removing a lot of the negativity that the U.S. and other Western nations have played in conflicts around the world. One of those things, as we mentioned before about the mineral and natural resource wealth of the Congo, is in the exploitation of minerals. And so when we were working with Raise Hope for Congo at first, we recognized that we needed to build a movement of people. And how do you build a movement of people if there's no connection? What can connect people to this conflict that for many Americans is happening half a world away? And they might not know anyone over there. And it's not something that's hugely relatable necessarily, especially to, high schoolers or really young people. And so one of the things that actually does directly connect us to this conflict are our electronics products. And these electronics products have 4 minerals in them, known as the 3 T's and G, the conflict minerals, tin, tungsten, tantalum, and gold. And these are mined in Congo and other places around the world, but the 3 T's especially, a large percentage of the world's supply comes from Congo. And a lot of these minerals are being mined in conditions, in conflict conditions, are being controlled by armed groups. They're controlling it through committing human rights abuses, through sexual violence, through slavery, through atrocities. And then those minerals are ending up on the international market in the supply chain of companies like Apple, like Dell, like Intel, like HP. So we realized that, through our own sphere, this is both something that everyone has a connection to. How many of you have cell phones? How many of you have cell phones in this room? All of those cell phones have these minerals in them. They're not necessarily from Congo, but they have the 3 T's and G. And so laptops, printers, some TVs, all these electronics products that we all use on a daily basis, that our schools have, that we buy in mass quantities and spend millions of dollars on as an institution, might have minerals in them that are helping to fuel armed groups committing atrocities in this place. And so we wanted to try to remove that negative influence and to do something about that. And it's also something you're carrying it around with you in your pocket. How do you get others, how do you get your friends to recognize that you have a connection? That's an automatic connection. And so that's how we sort of came up with this conflict minerals campaign. It is, in no means the only solution to the conflict in Congo. There's a lot of complexity to it, and there's a lot of different pieces and aspects of solutions that are going to hopefully one day soon solve the problem. But this is one small piece of it that we do have an impact on. And so as part of the Raise Hope for Congo campaign, 2 things were happening. One was our company rankings, and one was the Conflict-Free Campus Initiative. And what both of these aim to do is encourage companies that use these products to explore their supply chains and ensure that the minerals that they're sourcing from are not fueling conflict in Congo. We don't want companies to boycott. We don't want to boycott companies because we don't want them to pull out of Congo. A lot of Congolese, they use mines and they do mining as their livelihoods. And so, removing all of the mining would not help the Congolese communities that rely on that. But the companies can go in and ensure that the mines that they are sourcing from are conflict-free and are not controlled by armed groups. And that is within the company's power. As we've seen now. And so Enough put out company rankings of top electronics companies. The last one came out in 2012. And one of the most exciting things that's happened since then is that Intel, in January of this year, announced the first ever conflict-free product with minerals from Congo. And it's a microprocessor, which is used in tons of different electronics products. And they're actually hoping to have full conflict-free products by the end of 2016, which is incredibly exciting and is really a first. The Conflict-Free Campus Initiative, are any of you part of the Conflict-Free Campus Initiative? Okay, American University has a large chapter, and it's actually called Empower Congo. They have a group here on campus. If any of you are interested in checking it out, I can talk to you about it afterwards. But the Conflict-Free Campus Initiative is a movement. We've had 150 schools participate in the US, UK, since we began, and it's about getting college students involved in helping their campuses pass policies about procurement, about how their university goes about making purchasing decisions. And it encourages universities to pass a resolution stating that they prefer to purchase from companies who are taking steps to ensure that conflict-free minerals from Congo are not in their products. which is a huge deal because it sends a message to electronics companies, and it sends a message to these companies that this is something that's important. Click on that now. What we heard when we first started talking to companies about this, because we wanted to work with them, we didn't want to work against them unless they became difficult, like outside this Apple store where we had a protest. They told us that what would get you to change your policies on this. Basically, it's really expensive for them to go down their supply chain and figure out where their minerals come from. It takes a lot of time. It's really hard, and they like to complain because they're big businesses, and they didn't want to put any of that work in. And we said, well, what'll get you to change your mind? They said college students. They said that college students were the key demographic that would get them to change what they were doing, because you guys are the ones that they care about targeting, that they care about marketing to. You're the ones buying most of these products. College universities are purchasing millions upon millions of dollars worth of electronics every year. You guys are buying most of these products. And if you look at any, ads that Apple does, it's targeted at a pretty young demographic. And so campuses were the obvious place to go. And American University is actually one of 17 schools that's passed a resolution, which is awesome. And Empower Congo is now doing great work in general awareness raising and other avenues. And they're actually having a meeting tonight, if anyone's interested. So that's something that's really cool and really exciting about getting to come talk with AU students. So that message going out is really important. Other things that you can do that the Enough Project does is try to encourage folks to meet with their members of Congress. These guys work for you. We do advocacy trainings, lobby days, host conferences that galvanize hundreds of activists from around the country on all of these issue areas to talk to their members of Congress. There are a few members of Congress that are really knowledgeable, that have been to the region, that understand the role that the U.S. can play in supporting a lasting peace. But most of the members of Congress that are in session right now certainly have no idea what's going on, are not educated. You guys are way more up on these issues than they are. And they can do a lot, and you can target them. You can target the administration. One of the things that we like to talk about is creating a ladder of engagement. And so if you're working to, take on an issue and tackle a cause of some sort, looking for various entry points for people all along a spectrum of engagement is a great way to start. And I'll talk about that in a second too before we move into Q&A. So some people want to sign a petition, want to feel like they did that, and that's great, and that's all they'll do, and that's actually really important. Getting a lot of names on a petition can really make a difference. When the U.S. had no special envoy to Democratic Republic of Congo or the Great Lakes region a couple years ago, we worked with World Pulse, with Nima Namadamu, who's a great Congolese activist, and Change.org to deliver a petition of over 100,000 names to the U.S. government saying we need a special envoy, which is someone who will work solely full-time on this issue and on how the U.S. can play a positive role. And, a few months later, due to a lot of different factors, certainly not just because of that, but it played a role in former Senator Russ Feingold from Wisconsin being appointed to that position. And he's now working full-time on the Great Lakes region of Africa and on Congo. And so, just adding your name to something like that can be huge. But certainly getting more involved and actually going to conferences and starting clubs and talking to the media, doing letters to the editor, writing for your school paper. There's a lot of different ways that people can get involved. And what companies, not just companies, but also politicians tell us is that college students are the ones that they also listen to the most. We hear that from members of Congress all the time. They were student activists once, so they kind of like to reminisce about the days that they were involved in social activism before they became politicians. And, you guys are future voters, you're current voters, you have a wide range of communities, your families are voters. All of these things are reasons that they really care about what you have to say. And college students are historically at the crux of social movements in the past throughout U.S. history. So you're really in an awesome place to be able to do that. So just briefly wanted to mention 5 quick things that my colleague Annie actually pulled together. Annie Calloway runs our Conflict-Free Campus initiative, and she likes to talk about 5 tips for changing the world and how you can go about actually getting involved. All of you are probably here because you're passionate about a lot of things. And so keeping these 5 things in mind can often help. One is knowing your own story. What are the things that caused you to care about the things that you care about today? Who are you? Who can you influence? Why does this matter to you? Understanding that helps create connections between you and others who might be interested in joining your cause as well. Inform, educate, empower. This is really important because it's hard for people to want to join onto a movement if they don't understand the problem. You know, providing lots of educational materials, some will be read, some won't be read, that's fine. Being able to, you know, explain and understand what the issue is, whatever cause you're passionate about, is really important in bringing people into your movement. Similar to that is connecting it to the big picture. What is something that you know I can do right here that connects me to that issue? You know, talking about, you know, the cell phones with conflict minerals. That's something that I have that connects me to this issue. And you can find that in almost any cause that you're passionate about. We talked about the ladder of engagement, allowing people to sort of grow from, you know, someone who might be kind of interested to actually, you know, taking this on and becoming president of a club, or going and meeting with a member of Congress, or going and working for an organization about your cause. And finally, strength in numbers and relationship building. Chances are you are not the only one passionate about this. Find others who have overlapping interests. Find others who, it might not line up exactly, but there might be something connected in the international sphere, or you know, with poverty or social programs here domestically. Anything that you're passionate about, the more people you can bring into this movement, the better. And you can support their work and they can support yours. And it'll demonstrate, you know, widespread support for these ideas. So that's just a little bit about how we work and some of the things that you guys can do to get involved in anything that we're doing or anything that you're already passionate about. Anything that you want to do, you should run with. I think there's no sort of right or wrong issue to tackle, and certainly no right or wrong way to go about doing that. So whatever you feel drawn to is something that makes sense for you to contribute to in the world. So yeah, with that, I'd love to open it up for Q&A. And if you have more questions about Race Over Congo or anything like that, really happy to talk about it, especially on the campaigns and advocacy front. So thanks.
I'll start.
Yeah.
How do you fight against the short attention span of the news cycle when
Yeah.
trying to deal with an issue? You know, Syria was very much in the news, but until ISIL kind of brought it back into the news, it faded out, even though it was continuing for all these years. And there's many examples like that. How do you try to combat that?
Yeah, well, I'd certainly say Sudan is probably
Right, exactly.
an unfortunately great example of that, just what you say. It's incredibly difficult, and it's something that we actively struggle with as a professional organization working on this issue on a daily basis. Trying to connect your issues to things that might be happening in the world that aren't necessarily immediately related are really helpful. When you're working with reporters or anyone in the media, finding out what they're interested in and drawing the connections for them can help your story or your issue get more press than it might have otherwise. You know, talking about, for example, how, you know, genocide or a particular conflict is related to climate change or to poverty or to, you know, sexual violence and gender issues. There's a lot of different angles that you know, something like genocide or human rights abuses can take. And so trying to draw those connections for the media can be helpful. We think about that a lot when we work with, you know, government officials. What is it that they care about right now, and how can we prove to them, because we know intrinsically that it matters, how can we show them that it matters to what they're interested in, be it national security issues. You know, a lot of us are drawn to this work for moral and ethical reasons, but sometimes you need to add those other layers on as well. And trying different different angles. So if it's not if you just can't get a story in a paper, or it's not working to get sort of sustained media attention in that way, you can turn to social media, or you can turn to protests or other ways to get your message out there and keep it fresh and new, and try a lot of different markets. Some ideas, but certainly no silver bullet on that one.
Any other questions, comments?
Yeah.
Why do you think what's the reason that a group like ISIS has gotten more coverage than the Sudanese conflict? Why is that? Like it is, but like why?
Well, I'm not an ISIS expert, and so I don't want to speak necessarily, and I certainly can't speak to why, on behalf of the Enough Project for thinking about that. I have my own ideas. And I think part of it is the fatigue aspect. The Sudanese conflict has been going on, or the specific conflict that I'm talking about in relation to Sudan has just been going on for so long. And other conflicts are newer, and so it just gets more attention. It's something different. That is a huge reason that, there's sort of that short attention span that you were talking about. Whatever is sort of new gets placed up first, and then our attention span kind of wanes. I think that plays a huge role in it. I think the connections between American national security are more directly linked, even though I believe that it's an issue across the board, but it's not on people's minds quite as much necessarily. And yeah, I think there might be lots of reasons for that, unfortunately. Yeah.
Speaking to like the colonization aspect of these regions, and how there's such new countries in retrospect to like other nations in the world. So do you feel like taking more smaller measures is a smarter way to go about like fixing the, I guess, insurgency in these regions within like their governments and stuff like that? Or do you feel like America can play like an active role in actually like maybe getting rid of the rebel groups and doing all of that stuff? Like, how do you feel about that?
Well, I think there's a lot of really strong active steps that the U.S. can take, and that the international community can take, that do play an active role. One of the things that we are looking at right now is in how to create leverage over these governments so that they feel a bit of a pinch. Looking at, we talked about in Sudan and South Sudan, so much of the need for control is about wealth and power, and the corruption, and these political elites, especially in South Sudan. We just came out with a report looking at how, the negotiations are failing. And they're failing because the parties believe that they can win with a military solution. And what are they winning? They're winning power and money and wealth. And they're hiding their money and they're hiding their assets abroad so that they're not feeling any of the they're not feeling any of the issues that the people in their country are feeling. And we have a role to play in ensuring that they do feel that pinch. So, placing sanctions, looking at targeted sanctions on certain individuals at an international level by the regional body who's in charge of the negotiations. Looking at, asset freezes, making sure they can't actually access that money because they're not keeping it in these countries. They're keeping it in Kenya and Ethiopia. Looking at how to sort of create that leverage so that it shifts from, well, I can win if I just keep doing what I'm doing to, oh crap, actually this is hurting me and my own personal wealth, and since that's what I really care about, maybe I should change my, change the status quo a little bit. Maybe I can shift what I'm doing so that I can, stop hurting my own wallet here. Simplifying it a little bit, certainly, but I think that's a huge thing that the U.S. and others can do. And, helping to, just facilitate negotiations and reconciliation processes, helping support civil society groups in these countries who are, coming up with their own ideas and are want to be a part of the negotiations, ensuring that there's inclusivity and that it's not just, the people determining the peace for the future or the peace for the future, aren't just the people who've caused the problems, but are the civil society groups, are the religious organizations, are the women, are the leaders that actually have peace as their end goal. That's something that the U.S. can play a role in as well. Yeah.
So just to continue off of that, like I know that you had talked about the people you have people on the ground, like the man that you had shown us in the video, and considering that it is an internal conflict, I am of the belief that like it should be solutions by citizens for citizens. So
Yeah.
how does your group, ENAP, kind of propose, like, you bridge the gap with policymakers, so what kind of policies would you propose to kind of empower the people on the ground to make change for themselves, as opposed to like economic sanctions or U.S. involvement, but rather like a domestic effort?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, first I'll just say I totally agree with you, and we absolutely do as well. The people making change are the people on the ground, and ways to, there's a lot of different ways to empower them, and there are ways that the U.S. government can empower them. We as the Enough Project don't necessarily have funding to support civil society groups, but the U.S. government does. So we could support these groups who are actually after peace, who need to be included both at the peace negotiations table, and they're the ones doing building reconciliation initiatives on the ground. In Central African Republic especially, the faith communities are, really at the helm of the Christian and Muslim faith communities are at the helm of bringing these communities back together. So how do we, literally financially support some of these organizations? That's something that we can do that will enable them to gain the traction and gain the awareness and gain the momentum that they need to grow and spread the message that they want to spread, whatever it is that is. Another thing to do is to, as we do through Fidel and other field researchers and partners on the ground, is, our policy staff go and interview people and literally take that information, and that's what feeds our reports. And then we're feeding that to policymakers. So our hope is that the U.S. policymakers are listening to the people on the ground and making decisions and making choices based on the needs of those folks. And so, we're also looking at, justice and accountability. A lot of people in South Sudan are looking at, potentially wanting a hybrid court for perpetrating crimes against humanity and other war crimes. And so that's something that we've been pushing as well, is the establishment of a hybrid court, which is a joint internationally sort of funded, internationally backed South Sudanese court, so that there's sort of both international and South Sudanese presence at any court that's prosecuting for war crimes. And that's something that we sort of bring forth. I hope that kind of answers the question a little bit.
I just have one.
Yeah.
I was just
So I'm
wondering if there
curious.
were any initiatives on the ground from like your field researchers of like establishments of perpetrator-victim dialogues, and if that's had any success.
That's really interesting. I don't know of any off the top of my head in these ongoing conflicts. I'd love to try to find out. I can give you my email also if you can write to me with that question too. I can try to talk to some people and see if there's anything like that.
Maybe I can answer that question. There is what the government formed. The government in South Sudan formed the National Reconciliation and Healing Platform.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a government outfit. They just really need to place the international community that they are doing something. But in the actual sense, it's something that people sit on it for salaries. It's not really serious. There's something there that is symbolic, but it's not doing anything.
Yeah. And certainly anything coming out of Bashir or the government of Khartoum is not to be taken seriously. They're masterminds at everything they say.
Was there a question over?
I do have a question. This information might be a little bit outdated, but I know, because I don't know how long the political terms are in DR Congo. But I know that in the 2006 presidential election in DR Congo, there was a lot of Western aid sent to the DR Congo and sent to their government, and they kind of raised a lot of hope within the Congolese people about like kind of a new prosperous time for them. And I'm just wondering that, like, from the Western aid, because the DR Congo is technically still an ally of Great Britain and the United States, I just wonder if like the aid sent to them if you would still feel it's still like an ethical way to send aid to a government that's still tied to so much corruption.
For elections specifically?
Yeah.
Okay, that's not an issue that I'm an expert in, certainly, on the elections issue. I think there's a lot of complexity in international aid and the donor system, and something that needs to be looked at really seriously.
And I was also just
Sorry.
curious if there was a presidential election since 2006, as I wasn't sure on the terms.
Yes, there has been. But the terms are, it's all pretty iffy. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I know it was brought up earlier, but like just reference, what exactly is the role that the governments of China and Russia are playing in terms of like roadblocking and stopping progress in the region?
Well, I think our friend can probably speak to that even more so, as that's his expertise more so than mine, actually. It's great to have you in the room. You look like you actually had something to, yeah.
I'm not an expert on China-Russia issues, but what I know is that the government in Sudan has been trading with Russia for quite a long time, arms trade. And then China has the biggest share of oil in Sudan when it was not South Sudan and Sudan. So anything to do with sanction on the government, China will block it because it's going to affect the economy, it's going to affect oil. And Russia will also block it because it will stop the sales of arms. So it's all about, you scratch my back, I scratch your back, in a common man's language. But this is a very sticky issue, and it's a challenge to the Security Council to really convince China and Russia to see the humanitarian aspect of the problems in these countries. But China will look at the economic benefit as opposed to the crisis of the country.
Yeah. Can probably take one more if anyone has anything. Yeah.
I guess trying to get companies like Intel and Apple to stop, or I guess to ensure that they're getting minerals from conflict-free mines. I guess it's a good first step, but it definitely won't stop the violence and stop militia groups.
Absolutely.
Like future projects or long-term projects that you're thinking about, or is that, you really need to kind of spread the word first?
Well, I mean, so you're absolutely right. There's a lot of different things that need to happen in order for actual lasting peace to be established. We've identified that one as one particular project that we focus a good deal of our time and energy on because of our leverage with these corporations and these companies, and because of the specific sort of relationship that we have as the U.S. And as something based in the U.S. can play on that. But we're also looking at various other forms of funding sources to these armed groups. Reconciliation, accountability, justice. That's certainly something that matters a lot. Looking at the peace process, the negotiations among the actors, who's present, how that's going. There's a peacekeeping force in Congo currently, MONUSCO through the UN, and that's the largest peacekeeping force in the world right now. Which again is not actually going to create peace necessarily, but it is part of that puzzle, and they were a large part, in addition to the Congolese army, in defeating M23 rebel movement around this time last year. So there's definitely some movement towards peace through a lot of those different international structures and things at play. Yeah, so there's a lot on that.
Any last quick questions? Great.
Cool. Thanks,
Thank
guys.
you so much.
Yeah.